In this presentation, we will continue on with our comprehensive problem. We're going to be working here with the flexible overhead budget. The first thing we're going to have in our flexible overhead budget is the sales in units. We need to know how many units are going to be sold in order to do some of the calculations within our flexible budget. Remember that we had the 65, the 75, and the 85% of capacity level. We want to then know how many units we have at that capacity level. To do that, we're going to put our cursor first in the 65 at D55. This is cell D55, in other words, and say equals. And we're going to scroll up and we're going to go say this 20,000 is total capacity. That's what we are going to, the total capacity we can do. Now, we budgeted to be at 75% capacity level, but we're here in our flexible budget and we're at the component or the area of 65. I'm going to hard code that number. I'm going to say 0.65. So 20,000 times 0.65. Now, this is what we budgeted. This one's what we budgeted to be, the 75%. So I'll do the same thing. This equals the 20,000. And I could go to this 75, but I'm just going to say times 0.75. And then this one's going to be that same 20,000 again, total capacity times, and we're going to say 0.85. And so we got the 13,000 units, the 15,000 units, and the 17,000 units. Then we're going to look at the variable overhead costs. Variable overhead costs will include indirect material. Now we first want to know the variable cost per unit. And if we go back up to our data here, notice we don't really have the per unit costs. What we do have is the indirect materials. We know it's variable here, and we know that we calculated this budgeted amount based on the 75% of capacity. In other words, based on the 20,000 times 75% of units. Or in other words, we made the budget based on 20,000 times 0.75, 15,000 units. So to get the cost per unit, the variable cost per unit, we're going to say, all right, we're going to say this equals and scroll up to our budgeted amount. That's going to be the 15,000. And then we could divide it by, I'm going to put brackets around this. And so here's our formula up top. It's going to be the 20,000 times the 75 brackets. So, and then enter. So our formula then is B21 divided by E17 times E16 with the brackets. Now you could also use this 15,000 here. So you could say B21 divided by this 15,000, because that's also the same calculation of 75% times the 20,000 units. So 15,000 units, because this is the budgeted amount as well. So then next thing we're gonna have is our variable cost of indirect labor. Indirect labor, same calculation, same type of thing. I'm gonna say equals, and we're gonna scroll back up and we're gonna go to our budgeted. This is the total budgeted amount, 75,000. divided by the number of units, which is 20,000 times 75%, or 15,000. I want to do that with a formula that refers to our data. So times brackets, here's our formula up top. This number times this number and brackets. So in other words, it's 5 or B22 divided by E17 times E16 with the brackets, or you could say B22 divided by this 15,000 in units here. That'll give us our $5. The next we're going to have is the power. Same process. We're going to say this equals, and we'll scroll back up top to our budgeted information. We have the power. I'm going to say divided by, here's our formula, divided by brackets. We're going to go to the 20,000 times the 75,000 and close that up. So here's our formula and enter. So we get 1 once again. So it's B23 divided by E17 times E16, or you could say B23 divided by that 15,000. Okay, so the next item is going to be repairs and maintenance. So repairs and maintenance, same calculation, equals. Scrolling up top, here's the repairs and maintenance. We're going to say divided by brackets, the 20,000 times the 75%. Here's the calculation up top, brackets, and enter. Double clicking on that. Once again, that's the B24 divided by E17 times the E16, or you could just take divided by that 15,000. That'll give us 2. And then we're going to add those up. We're going to sum those up, and that'll give us the total variable costs. So I'm going to say equals the sum of these items, and there's 9 are total variable costs. So now that we have that information, we could figure out the capacity level. So we have the units, the different units here, and of course the budgeted amount was at 15, so you'll note that when we get to 75%, the variable costs will be the same as the items that we pulled it from over here, the overhead budget at 75% capacity. That's what our expectation is. But now we're breaking it out at different capacity levels, 65, 75, and 85. So the 75 will of course match our budgeted capacity level. So now we're just going to take this equals the 13,000 units at the 65% capacity times the 1, which is of course just 13,000. And we could do this all the way down. This equals the 13,000 times the 5. This equals the 13,000 times the 1. This equals the 13,000 times the 2. And there we have it. Now note you can also use the auto formatting to copy this down. I'm going to delete this just for Excel purposes. You could try to copy this down. Note this is not going to work, and then we'll fix it. If I use the autofill and copy this down, it doesn't do what we expected. You'll note that this cell moved down. This cell moved down like we wanted. This one moved down like we didn't want. So I want to tell Excel, hey, don't move this cell down, and you're good moving this cell down. So how do we do that? We use absolute references or a mixed reference. I'm just going to use an absolute reference. So this cell is D55. So that cell right there, D55, we want to make that absolute so that we can copy it down. One way to do that is to select F4 on your keyboard, or you could put a $sign before the D, a $sign before the 55. So that's going to be an absolute reference. We really only need a mixed reference, but the absolute reference will work. So I'm going to say enter. And then when I copy this down, it does what we would expect to do. If I double click, it looks like what we would expect. So I'm going to underline this. Now this cell we can do two ways. I could say it's going to be the 13 times the 9, because the total variable cost will work. Or alternatively, and what I typically prefer, is to sum up the cells above. So equals SUM using the sum function of these cells. So not the 13,000 up here, the 13,000 here and below. Now we'll do the same thing for the capacity level at the 75%. So we'll start off once again with the 15 times the 1. And so there we have that. And we could do this all the way down, the 15 times the 5, enter, equals the 15 times the 1, enter, equals, and the 15 times the 2. We'd like to copy that down in Excel though, so if I remember to do that, we're going to have to say, I'm going to double click on this and say, this cell, I don't want it to move that down. This one I do. Therefore, this one I need to lock. That lock-in is an absolute reference. We'll put our cursor on this cell. F4, $sign before the E, $sign before the 5. Has nothing to do with money. It's just an absolute reference. And then we'll copy that down. So there we have that. We'll underline this one. Same thing for, well, then we can this one is the sum function, recall. So we could copy this one this way, because this is summing up here. If I autofill that over, it'll sum up there. So that's what we want if we add those up. Now we'll do this one. This equals the 17 times, and this is at capacity at 85%, 17,000 units then, because 85% of 20,000 as the total capacity. So the 17 times the 5, and so on and so forth. Let's just autofill this one down, because we've seen this before. So here's the F, that one's the one I want to lock. F55, we'll put our cursor there, and F4 that item. $sign before the F, $sign before the 55, and enter. Then we'll autofill that down. So we'll select that item, autofill it down, underline that bottom cell, and then we can sum these items up. We can multiply the 17 times the 9, or we can copy this across and it will sum up. So this is the sum here, as we can see. If we then autofill it across, it is also the sum there. So there we go with that. Looks good. Next thing we're going to have is the fixed costs, the fixed overhead costs. So fixed overhead costs, colon, is going to be the typical kind of formatting. Now the information, the fixed overhead, we could just pull this information from our data up here too, because it's going to be in the same format. We got the data up top in terms of our overhead budget. So we're on overhead budget in A19. Depreciation, building, machinery, taxes, supervision. I could just copy those and put them down here, or I could use references. We could say this in A63 equals, and scroll up and say I want to pick up that depreciation on the building and enter. And then the next one is going to be equal to, scrolling up, the depreciation on machinery and enter. The next one is equal to, scrolling up, and we can pick up the, we have the two depreciation, taxes and insurance. And again, this is another item that you can auto-fill down, and sometimes it's a little confusing, it doesn't have numbers. I'll show that by deleting these items, put our cursor on this one, and then just auto-fill it down, and even though it's words, it'll still pull down the text just like it would if it was numbers, which is nice. All right, so then we're going to put these items in the fixed column. These are going to be fixed. We're not going to have a variable per unit number. We're just going to assume that they're always the same. So we'll be in the total fixed column and just say this equals, and we'll just go up to that fixed number. We don't need to do any changes to it. It equals that number right there. Enter. And then this equals for the machinery, just the exact same thing. Depreciation machinery, 71,000. It doesn't change. It's fixed. And then the taxes and insurance equals, if we scroll up to the taxes and insurance, the same number, it doesn't move. And then once again for the supervision, it should be the same number as well with the supervision. We can also autofill that down, so I'm going to delete this, do it one more time with the autofill. If we put our cursor on the 24 and autofill it down, it should pick up the same numbers. So there we have it. Now you might want to check that, and I use these little items a lot to say, where did that come from? And you could say, oh, it points to right there. So if you want to, I put these items up top. They're in the data tab. So if you consider, actually, they're in the formulas tab, and they're over here in the formula auditing. So I would right click on these and add them to the custom toolbar. These three items here, that's what I do, and then I can use these little arrows to say, well, where did that go? And we have that item here. So then I use this one to erase it, or we could use this one to erase it, which is nice. So that's going to be our total fixed costs. So then that'll give us our total fixed costs, and we can then sum these up. I'm going to underline this item, home tab, font, underline, and then we'll just sum up. Equals SUM, brackets, and sum 24, 71, 17, 280, 250. That's going to give us the 392,250. Now, it doesn't matter what capacity level we have. It's always going to be the same if they're fixed for our flexible budget. That's what it means to be fixed. So it doesn't matter if we make 13,000 units, 15,000 units, 17,000 units. The fixed costs are fixed costs. So we're just going to go ahead and say equals that number, and I'll do that all the way across, right? I'm just going to say equals that number and equals that number. And the reason I can do that is that then I can then autofill this all the way down. So I can highlight these three cells and say I just want to make that 75 go all the way across, all the way across, all the way across. So I'm going to highlight those three numbers, and then we'll autofill all the way down. So now it picked up, because that equals that equals that, right? It picks up the same numbers all the way across. Now we do need to reformat and put an underline. So I'm going to put an underline under supervision, highlighting these three cells, home, font, underline. And then the fixed costs total, if we sum these up, there's the sum. I just need to copy that across. It'll be the same formula relative as well. So I'm going to autofill across like so. And there we have those items. And that'll give us the total overhead. So the total overhead costs then will be equal to, I'm going to say equals the variable costs portion plus the fixed cost portion. And there's the 509,250. If we put our cursor on the 509,250 and autofill it to the right, there we have it. So there's going to be our flexible overhead budget. So our flexible overhead budget at capacity level 65, 75, 85 is 509,250, 527,250, and 545,250.